That's great. Okay, any questions about attachment before we start moving into temperament? Anything that I've said that people are feeling uncomfortable with? And this is a great place to raise it if you want. Do we want a mic? Do we need the mic, or will she be picked up?
I'm sorry.
Just wondering if you'll be addressing crying it out.
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah. So why don't we talk about that right now, crying it out. So here's, and are you specifically thinking around sleep, or are you, okay, sleep, okay. So our position at AMP is that we're not buying it. There are a number of people, and maybe some of you are in the room, is that there are a number of people who are calling themselves sleep trainers and therapists. And parents are paying these people fairly significant amounts of money to help them come in and help them learn how to put their babies to sleep. And some of that does involve crying it out. So crying it out, I see some people are probably parents and became parents at the same time that I became a parent. At the time, Ferberizing was very popular. So who knows about Ferberizing? Okay. So first of all, before I say anything more, I have to say this. Nobody in this room gets to leave here saying, oh my God, I've wrecked my kids. You just don't, because you and I both know it. You know, when we worry about things like neglect and development that is derailed because of the environment, we're talking about kids who are really not experiencing good stuff consistently and predominantly during the course of their day. But let's talk for a minute about crying it out in the context of sleep and everything we just talked about in terms of attachment. So what part of leaving a baby in a room by himself, crying, feels right to any of you? And bring it on, because I'm really happy to have this conversation. Right? So I think I'm talking to a room full of converted, first of all. It was very popular. Ferberizing your baby was very popular when I was a parent. But about 5 or 6 years ago, guess what Dr. Ferber did? He said he was wrong. He actually publicly came out and said that was not the appropriate thing to do with young children, right? I think when parents are having difficulty knowing how to put their babies to sleep, the first place to be calling is actually Healthy Babies, Healthy Children. Our nurses are actually trained to support parents with this very challenging part of being a parent, right? Because sometimes that crying out isn't about what's going on in that moment. It's actually what happened 2 hours before it was sleep time, right? So you've really got to know that you have to look at the child's whole day and whole routine when you're trying to help a family manage that sleep time. So I would discourage you. I was at a training last Friday, actually, at CDI, where somebody said to me she was an early childhood educator. She also was a fairly new mom, and she said she was attending a parenting group where 11 of the 12 parents, and she was parent number 12, had hired sleep trainers. Yeah, so, you know, I would really caution you, and I believe in fact Canada is trying to coordinate, and I think they've been in touch with Bestard as well, coordinate a position statement on this. So I would really encourage you to discourage the crying it out with one exception. If a parent is about to lose it, okay? You know, and that applies for timeout as well, right? If I'm about to lose it, then it may just be exactly what I have to do. Put my baby down and leave. Put my child in a safe space and leave, okay? But that has really shifted to not being a discipline strategy. That is really a protection strategy. And I'm going to encourage you to understand it that way. And don't mix it up with the discipline conversation. really it's a different reason we would encourage parents to actually go to that place. Does that answer your question? Anything else? Okay, so let's talk about temperament and developmental outcomes. So temperament is more strongly related to developmental outcomes for children experiencing poor quality parenting than children experiencing better quality parenting. We also know that for moms who are actually experiencing depression during their pregnancy, they're at a much higher risk of actually having a baby with a difficult temperament. And then if they continue to experience depression after that baby is born, you can imagine how challenging that can be for both mom and for baby. Baby might be cueing, mom may not be able to even recognize the cue, much less respond to the cue, right? So some of that is about temperament. So when you're that child who's in that poor quality parenting relationship, temperament is going to be a pretty strong influencer at that point. So it's hard, especially in the context of looking at discipline and challenging behavior, to not think about this thing that we call goodness of fit, right? So what is my temperament as a parent compared to in terms of my child's temperament? Are we a good fit, or are we really mismatched in terms, so, you know, on certain qualities of temperament, I'm at one end of the scale and my child is at the other end of the scale.
I did distribute this on the tables, but I'll go around the back. I saved a few copies and try to give out a few more. I have a few more.
I think I thought I had
thought you said that.
but it just seems I had. No, it actually isn't in here. Okay, so the handout, and I thought I had it, and it's funny because it's in my printed deck, but somehow oh, there it is. Okay. So this is what Louise is passing around, and this was created by Greg Lubimon, and I will tell you there are like all very similar to this, but there are, you know, even pretty versions that you can purchase online if you wanted to. Greg put this together and has given us permission to share this with people. So this is a great conversation to have, because what you're essentially trying to do is identify where is the child compared to the parent on these areas of, on these dimensions of temperament, right? And you can start to see that if they're really at two opposite ends, that can be pretty challenging for a parent. You know, a few years ago, we had, trying to figure out how we can get a copy of it, we had actually developed this as an online activity for TVO. So a parent could go in, they could identify their temperament, their child's temperament, and a little box would pop up, you know, saying something like, oh, your activity level is very low, but you've rated your child's as very high. Here are some things that you might want to consider adjusting, right? So it would give parents a way to actually respond to that, because you can imagine, you know, if that child really does have a very high activity level and parent has a very low activity level, which if you think about it, like I'm thinking back to when my kids were under 5, and at the end of a workday, my activity level was pretty low compared to my kids who were still like raring to go at the end of the day, right? Positive affect, attention, ability to focus, you know, how much effort are kids going to actually put in, that effortful control. And anybody who's watched the marshmallow experiment, you can just look that up. The kids are brought into a room and they're given a plate with a marshmallow, and they're told that, you know, if they can not eat the marshmallow for 30 minutes, you know, the researcher's going to come back and give them 2 marshmallows, right? And so not eating the marshmallow is a good example of effortful control. it takes a lot to not eat that marshmallow for most kids, right? So this is something that you can print up. You can use, add it to your toolbox. Great conversation, I think. It really works well in home visits especially, because there isn't any judgment that this comes with, right? It's not about saying, oh, well now I'm going to add this up and this means that you have this score and this score means this. No, it really just illustrates where, for a parent who might be struggling with some of those behavior issues, why they might be struggling, right? How that temperament might fit with everything. So the goodness of fit demands, and the demands and expectations of people in the environment are compatible with the child's temperament. So there's a good fit that's there, right? So when you have a good fit, there's a higher probability of healthy development. When you have a poor fit, it places children at risk for developing behavioral and or emotional problems, right? Because, parents may not be as patient, they may not be able to figure out what kinds of experiences work for a child, what kinds of reactions to expect from a child. Sensitive and effective parenting requires parents to adapt their expectations to provide a good fit with their child's temperament. I can often remember saying to my husband when our kids were little, things like, just to remind you that we're the adults and they're the children, right? Because often he would say things like, well, he's just got to change, or she's just got to change. And it's like, well, that's going to be hard for our 10-month-old baby to do, and you're the dad in the relationship. This is very hard work for many parents, okay? Unfortunately, in too many cases, the fit is not there, and for this reason, what we want to think about is temperament of the child, temperament of the parent. Are there poor environmental conditions at play as well? Is there potentially, possibly, a mental illness in terms of the parent or the child that's happening? Are there attachment issues at play or biological issues for either the child or the parent that are going on? Some of the highlights from research: when parents use the same child-rearing practices with different children, they evoke different responses and reactions because each child's temperament, age, and other characteristics are different. These influences contribute to why, as every parent knows, siblings develop unique characteristics and parental practices held to account for these differences. Right? So I talk about my husband because he's not here. And hopefully he's not going to see this recording. But he would always maintain, we have to be really consistent with both kids. We have to do the same thing for both kids. And it was like, yeah, except one of our kids, our daughter, the second child, to this day, has a pretty kind of, can have an explosive kind of temperament, right? Where she can get pretty angry pretty quickly, right? And our son is a little calmer. So we have to be able to react and manage their temperament accordingly, right? The same approach is not going to work. Okay, regulation. Any other questions on temperament, and how are we just doing? Just check for time.
You've only got 45 minutes.
Yeah,
Good.
good. So regulation. In the newborn, regulation is unstable and is not a predictor of regulation capacity later. And physical systems are not well regulated in early infancy and will take time. Which is why, bringing it back to that crying out again, they don't have the capacity. They just don't. They can't do it. Right? So yeah, they can regulate things like body temperature, heart rate, respiration rate, right? Because as soon as they're born, those regulatory functions they have to take on. But regulating emotion is going to now begin to develop. So even something as simple, and maybe you do or maybe you don't think about it this way, and parents may not think about it this way, thumb sucking. That is regulation. That is absolutely one of the first signs of a child's capacity to regulate. And maybe it's not a thumb, maybe it's a pacifier, or maybe it's a blanket, or Maybe it's the sound of certain music. It could be anything that helps the baby who's distressed calm down and soothe themselves, right? So, managing and modulating, adjusting to conditions, right? And that's really what we're saying as we look at regulation within individual children. So processes used to manage and change if, when, and how one experiences emotions and emotion-related motivational states, as well as how emotions are expressed behaviorally. Every kid is going to do this differently. Every kid's capacity to regulate is going to be different, right? This is one of the last areas within the brain to actually develop, right? I remember I used to work at Queen's Park, and when I was at Queen's Park, which would have been, I guess, prior to 95, the graduated licensing system for drivers was being introduced, right? Anybody know one of the big reasons for introducing that system? We had a high rate of young people getting into accidents, speeding. Why? Because they couldn't always regulate their behavior when they were behind the wheel of a very powerful vehicle, right? So regulation is something that actually doesn't finish developing into our adult years. And for some people, never finishes developing, and some people are just bad at regulating, right? Like road rage is an example of poor regulation, right? Something's happened and you lose it, right? It's like when that guy cuts you off and you say, okay, you know what, I am just going to follow him so closely, it's going to piss him off, and then you realize, whoa, but if he slams on his brakes, that's not going to be good for him or for me. I better just let this go, right? So it's the capacity to do that. And if you think about kids birth to 5, and when we expect them to regulate those overwhelming emotions on their own, or to do it because we've raised our voices, indicating to some degree a level of our own dysregulation, right? Do they really have the capacity to do this by themselves? Now, some kids may, depending on their temperament, right? But some kids may not, and they really still need your help. So regulation is absolutely very complex. It will require a part of the brain right behind your forehead called the prefrontal cortex. So inside of that prefrontal cortex, that's where things like inhibitory control, working memory, and problem-solving skills are actually housed, right? So when the child is dysregulated, what actually happens is the prefrontal cortex shuts down completely, right? So the part of the brain that would actually help Jack, or Joey, whatever we called him, think about why he needs to be sitting down quietly at the table, has completely shut down when he's misbehaving. So these two things are really, really connected with each other, right? So when a baby cries, that is essentially a baby saying, hey, I am dysregulated at this moment. The response to that cry is going to help that baby to regulate, right? Now, it's a little easier when we use that crying example, right? Because instinctively, I think a lot of us, when we hear a crying baby, we want to step in and we want to comfort that baby. But now, think of that 3 or 4-year-old who's tantruming instead. How willing are we to step into that? Or is it easier to step away and say, you know, I'm just going to wait till you've calmed down? Except the prefrontal cortex, which would help that 3 or 4-year-old calm down, has shut down. And in order to reactivate it, that child actually needs you to be there. So eventually, when, you know, for the baby who gets that response, that baby is going to learn that by communicating distress, caregivers are going to help. And now let's go back to that baby who's crying it out, right? And parents will say to me, well, you know, you're wrong, it works. My baby stopped crying. Oh, okay, so let's talk about that. Why do you think that baby stopped crying? Exhausted. Anybody ever cried themselves to sleep? Exhausted, right? You're very upset about something, you're crying, and eventually, without even realizing it, you give up and you cry yourself to sleep. And in fact, what that baby might be learning, and this is where I have to caution us, because some may have left their babies to cry themselves to sleep. It would take a lot more than just that. But if that baby's experiencing that lack of response there, and then experiencing it several times during the day, what's getting wired into that baby's brain is that my distress isn't actually important to you. That in fact, I can't really count on you when I'm feeling upset. That you do not come to help me when I don't feel good about things. Okay, do we have internet here?
Yeah, well, we've got the video.
Okay,
going on
oh,
there.
great, okay, good. So let's just watch this little video.
Okay, we waited long enough. Okay. Nom 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 nom. Oh, nom 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 nom.
Always very creative, the folks at Sesame Street. So, any thoughts about that particular video? Any comments? Who would you use that with? Yeah, I think so, right? Like, I actually showed it to my kids when I first found it. I was like, you have to see this. And they, you know, I'm sure they just thought, oh, you know, here she goes again. But really, a lot of it was just, yeah, this thing called regulation, this is very, very hard. And it's hard at whatever age you happen to be at. This is what makes it so hard, right? So it requires the ability to attend, to actually be focused. that ability really doesn't start to happen for babies until they're almost 10 months old, right? It requires effortful control, which doesn't actually develop until they're almost 4 years old, right? So I'm just trying to think about that kid who's been sort of, put over here to calm down, and how much effortful control we're expecting of that 3-year-old by himself. And that's really the key, right? Is we're expecting him or her to do it by themselves, right? It's not possible. The structures in their brains are simply not developed enough to be able to calm down when they are showing us that behavior by themselves. They really do need us to step in, not to step out. It also means that that young child has to organize a number of responses. So lots of things have to be connecting in the brain. But regulation is also really, really connected to our physiology and to our body movements. I mean, when we're really mad, right, we could hurt somebody. So there's an element of controlling what's happening in our body, controlling, managing our emotions, our cognitive functioning, right? To be able to reason with ourselves, getting too close to that car, it's tempting, but it's not going to be good for me in the end, because if he slams on his brakes, I'm in trouble. Being able to think that through, because let's face it, how many of you knew adults who can't think that through? Right? So really think about whatever method you're using when it comes to discipline. Does the child actually, what am I aiming for? What do I want to get out of this interaction? And does the child actually have developmentally the capacity to do what I'm expecting him or her to do? And then, of course, managing behavior, regulating behavior. So it's a process, this thing called regulation. We are born with it, that physiological stuff is happening. Some develop it and will be largely influenced by experiences. Research has shown that early development of self-regulation has a very direct relationship to better functioning in other domains, other parts of our life, right? Regulation is going to influence even things like our relationships at home, at work, right? It really does permeate all aspects of our life. Now, let's connect the two things, regulation and attachment, right? It's about maintaining a balance. For infants, the attachment system is that external regulation system, right? It helps them to maintain a balance when they become dysregulated. It's interesting, my daughter, who's 17, she finished high school a semester early, decided to go to India and volunteer in an orphanage. And she is in a room with 10 babies on her own. And she, the other day, said to me, they cry and I can't get to them. And then she said, and then I'm noticing some of these babies will stare at the ceiling for 3 hours at a time. And she said to me, is that normal? And I said, you know what, that's a really good question. Is that normal? It's not normal, right? And what has that baby really learned? That when I cry, no one comes, right? That baby has really given up. Over time, the baby begins to show some increased stability and variety of mood and arousal and response to the different cues that are coming in from the external world. And by the end of infancy, a baby will have developed the ability to calm themselves down for brief periods. So, by 18 months is what we're talking. Now they've figured out, if I suck my thumb, or if I go cuddle up in the corner, or if I go to mommy and just sit on her lap, or I go over to daddy and cuddle with him, that makes me feel better, right? So they've started to figure out how to manage those feelings and what strategies are going to help them get back to a better place. Signs of poor regulation in young children, difficulty with sleep routines and feeding routines. This is the most obvious stuff we see. They're difficult to soothe when they're picked up. Right? Unable to avert a gaze, they're non-reactive to cues from their caregivers, or they react negatively to cues from their caregivers. They're not receptive to stimulating toys. They have frequent changes in mood. Reactions to stressors are out of proportion to whatever the event is. Inappropriate activation of the stress response system, right? So this is that baby that is really crying all the time, right? And just can't seem to regulate down. Has difficulty calming down, out of touch with internal states such as hunger, temperature, and you know, that one is really hard to understand, what that looks like in a baby. And I was unlucky enough to see what that looked like in a baby. I've actually seen it now in 2 infants. The first one was a baby who had one cry for everything. Because she really, all she knew was, I don't feel good. I don't know why I don't feel good, but I don't feel good. And it was one cry. And her caregivers would spend their days trying to guess what it was. So they'd like go down the list, right? Diaper, hunger, you know, tired, hot, cold. And every time that baby cried, they'd have to go down the list, which can be pretty exhausting, right? And the second time I saw it was a baby who would get dysregulated as soon as his system was even a little bit overwhelmed, whether it was good overwhelmed or bad. So he could be playing and totally engaged and having a delightful time, but that activation of his system would throw him off. And that happiness, that delight, would turn into tears very quickly, right? And the big, you know, it seems so silly to me, well, not silly, it's amazing how simple the solution can be sometimes, because what was the solution? It was about bringing him close. He actually needed, as he got sort of aroused, good or bad, before he got to that place where he lost it, he needed his caregiver to step in with him and to help him, right? So that is a difficult one to see. In older kids, and this is really important, because now we're into that 18-month to 24, 30-month-old, where we might be seeing some of that challenging behavior that we, you know, are at risk of using phrases like, oh, he's difficult, he's bad, he's, you know, out of control, whatever. But when it's a regulation issue, right, what we're seeing is aggression towards other kids. We're seeing that they're unable to express and label their emotions, that they're unable to understand the emotion that is shown by other people. They get frustrated very easily. They have difficulty establishing routines. They have difficulty following tasks, difficulty taking turns, difficulty sustaining attention and switching attention, and they're highly distractible. And I can tell you, in my 3rd year Bachelor of Child Development program, a lot of my students on day 1 would describe these things as bad behavior. They would not be thinking about them as regulation issues. And then you can see how very quickly it turns into we got to discipline, right? Because this is not acceptable.
You have a question back there? Do you need a mic or?
No, I think I'm okay. I'm just curious how you would discern, how a professional would discern the difference between a regulation problem that a child is having and attachment disorder that might be present in a relationship with a parent. I mean, often they would be tied together, I would think, but could it be that they're different, but they show up almost the same?
They're pretty connected. So let me just repeat the question. How would you distinguish between behavior that might be indicative of an attachment disorder versus a regulation issue. So anyone who's seen me talk before, I haven't included it in this particular presentation, but a lot of it comes down to how you observe the young child, right? And so you've got to look at, to start with, look at the caregiving, right? So what is the quality of the caregiving? Is it attentive, responsive, reparative when the child is having difficulty? Or is it harsh or punitive? I mean, let's just be honest here. We've all seen that parent who loses it with that 6-month-old. And not just loses it once, but maybe loses it several times over the course of a day, right? But I would need to be observing that dyad fairly, several times to be able to say, okay, so really what we've got here is there's an attachment issue that's going on. It is resulting in a regulation issue as well, right? So the thing with understanding, and I'm going to say for 0 to 3, really, you can't look at a young child's behavior, the good and the bad, without looking at the relationship with caregivers. And I include all caregivers in this. I'm not going to say this is just about parents. This is about any caregiver who's spending significant time with a child, because the quality of that interaction is going to help you decide whether this, because where does, the real question I think you want to ask is, where do I begin the work? Am I beginning the work at the attachment relationship, or am I beginning the work on regulation? And quite often for kids, even at 4 or 5, it really is the attachment relationship that has to start, right? That's the piece that's not been formed as well as we like. For many kids, not all though. For some kids, it really is, they really have trouble regulating, right? It's not attachment, they're in a very responsive relationship. And then you have to start looking at things like temperament, right? And yeah, what are the strategies in terms of regulation that a child is using? And sometimes some of the behavior that's on the list, the negative ones, are actually, for that child, protective strategies. Right? So I'm really pushing you guys to reframe the negative behavior. I'm not saying you ignore it. I want to be really clear about that. That's not what the campaign is about. That's not what the campaign promotes. But it's really about understanding the why behind the behavior. Now, if I'm in a family where when I ask or I whimper, there's generally no response, but gee, when I throw myself on the floor, I usually get a response. What I'm learning and what I'm wiring into my brain is that in order to get my needs met, this is what I have to do. And then I go to daycare or I go to kindergarten and I have a need, and what I've learned is in order to get it met, I have to throw myself on the floor. But what is the person there seeing? Possibly they're seeing bad behavior. We better get this under control, Oddly enough, yesterday, Theo was at daycare yesterday too, and
That's the dog.
That's the dog. I picked him up, and the daycare provider said to me, "You've got some work to do." And I said, "Really? What is it? What happened?" And she said, "Well, he's quite the biter." And I said, "Oh yes," I showed her all of my scars. And she said, "Yes, but you need to discipline him." It was an interesting conversation because for me, his biting is a lot of protective behavior, like we're trying to cut his nails or something, and he doesn't like that. So she said, really handle his paws a lot. But understanding, and I use, I never present videos of kids. You'll never, unless it's something we've actually staged with actors, we don't generally present videos of kids who are having difficulties. So I do use examples of things like my puppy to illustrate the point. We have to be thinking about the why behind the behavior, because otherwise that is when it turns into punishment. So you may still need to discipline the child who's throwing himself on the floor. But when it's discipline, part of what's in your package, in your response, is thinking about how am I going to build some other strategies for this little one when he has a need that has to be met. Because right now, his toolbox, there's one tool, throw myself on the ground. With the older kids, sleeping is an issue, increased startle, so they startle very, very quickly. Balance and movement, regulating bodily functions, not meeting their milestones, no interest in new activities or novel things, frequent tantrums, difficulty with transitions, overreactions, mood shifts, unable to stay on a task for 10 minutes. I know a lot of 4-year-olds who can't stay on task for 10 minutes. That's a pretty big amount of time, especially if nobody has actually helped you to do that. You know, again, thinking about my nephew and my niece, and they were really keen on showing me that Joey knew his colors and his shapes, right? And I finally had to say to them, you need to stop, because here's the challenge. I can't understand a word he says. That's a bigger problem. And his daycare teacher is complaining because he can't stay on task for 10 minutes. So rather than working on the numbers and the colors, which, by the way, they're going to teach him in junior kindergarten, and this morning I heard in Ottawa in both French and English, focus on helping him to regulate and to keep his attention. But that requires from the parent an investment, right? So when I talk about reading with him, you know, we read him stories. Well, I sat with him and I was reading him Bernstein Bears. If anybody knows Bernstein Bears, these are like pretty complex stories for a kid under 3. I'm thinking, is he really going to understand this? But he was totally engaged with me. And in fact, we finished the story and what did he say? More Auntie Chaya. More, right? He needs help to do more of that than to do the numbers and the colors. Okay, resilience. A system within the individual that requires competence, effective behavior, and adaptive capacity. This is huge. And this is probably, for me, one of the things that concerns me the most in people's misperception of early mental health and early development. Kids are not just resilient. They don't just automatically recover because they're kids. Kids who are resilient have had caregiving and attachment relationships that have helped them to become resilient, to be able to learn how to recover, you know, when things don't go well. It is hard. It requires the involvement of a lot of systems, right? So the learning system of the brain, the attachment system, the motivation system, the stress response system, the regulation system, the family system as well, the school system, the peer system, the cultural and societal systems, right? It's huge. And if you're looking for more on this, Anne Maston is excellent. She's got lots of good literature out there about resilience, but it is tough. Do you guys have a resource?
Well, we do have a resource also on building resilience that is designed for parents, and a ready-to-use workshop you can use for parents on that too. So there's promo here.
That's great. That's great.
The copies are at the booth, and you
Yeah.
can take a look at them. So we probably have time to do executive functioning, and then we'll take a break.
Yeah, is that okay? Does that work? Okay. So the other thing that people misunderstand is that adversity builds resilience. That by going through tough times, you become a resilient person. But really, it's by going through tough times and having somebody there to help you through it. That's how you become a resilient person. Right? I use a terrible example. So like today I'll go home and I'll be tired because it's Friday. And I'll watch bad TV like The Young and the Restless. And there's a character in there, Victor Newman, who's like this multinational billionaire who had a really horrific childhood, right? And my point is, that is the stuff of soap operas. That isn't reality. Adversity does not build resilience. And I find with my kids who are 17 and 20 now, I'm still building resilience, right? Like last Friday, my son had an interview. He's training to be a pilot, and he had an interview for his co-op. And so he went Friday morning for the interview, and he thought, he had understood he would hear by Friday night. There was no phone call. And he was like, yeah, I didn't get it. And I moved into helping him to recover, and it was a conversation about, what? There are going to be times when you get it and times when you don't, right? And really helping him to benefit from that experience, from what was, really not a pleasant experience. The good news was the call came Saturday morning. Right? So there are no invulnerable children. There are levels of risk and adversity so overwhelming that resilience actually doesn't occur, and recovery is extraordinarily rare or impossible. So I want to think about for a minute, just bringing us back to this issue of discipline and challenging behavior, and think about kids, because we got kids who are 3.8 years old in our school system now, right? And some of what we're hearing is schools are somewhat overwhelmed by some of the behavior. Are other people hearing that? I heard Robin Williams. For those who don't know Robin, she's an Associate Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province of Ontario, had stated the other day that the expulsion rate in children under 5 is higher than all the other years put together. Right? And here's the thing, and the reason I bring that example in here. So that child who's, maybe showing any of these behaviors at school, right? And the decision gets made, maybe the first week he's next to the teacher, the second week he's in the hall or she's in the hall, the third week she's in the principal's office, and the fourth week the call is going home to say, you get to come once a week for 10 minutes for a modified school day, right? That is adversity for a young child. And I hear phrases that frighten me, like the walk of shame from the classroom to the principal's office. That, honestly, that makes me want to cry. I just cannot even imagine that being either of my children experiencing that, not just once, but every day, that walk. Or coming into school and knowing you only get to stay for a heartbeat, and then you have to go home. And here's the worst part. When this is an issue, the problem becomes that when we send that child home, nobody's unraveled that puzzle of why. So we don't know what's going on at home, right? And what if this is, to the question you had asked earlier, an attachment issue or a regulation issue? Who's actually helping this child and is punishing him by keeping him out of school really going to address the behavior? So let's just watch this video, and then I think we're ready for a break.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotion, the activity, and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment with the mother, where she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Oh, come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yeah.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay, so I think we're taking a 15.
We'll take, yeah, it's supposed to be half an hour. If 20
Oh,
minutes
okay.
is okay with you, and we'll meet back at 10:45 in here, and we'll keep going.